Great. So we've kind of spoke about your typical day, month, year in your role, but what was not typical was last year when you jetted off to install the world's highest weather station. So first of all, how did that even come about? How did you get approached? How did you end up on top of Everest?
Yeah, that was certainly an unusual thing to get, to be part of, and it started connected. Well, the connection is to what I said really early on in this chat. I mentioned that we don't have many measurements from the mountains and places that the glaciers are, and I put in an application to National Geographic to get some funding to install some weather stations in the Indian Himalaya. And I outlined there in the application that those weather stations, should they be funded and installed, would be two of the highest weather stations in the world. They weren't particularly high, what I was suggesting. It just reflected the fact that, the Indian Himalaya are high to begin with. You fly in to this particular city, it's 3,500 meters. That's a long way higher, 2.5 times pretty much the height of Ben Nevis. So you start at great altitude. It certainly wasn't, a hugely tall order to satisfy to say these would be two of the highest weather stations in the world. It just so happened that National Geographic were planning to go to Mount Everest to conduct the largest multidisciplinary scientific expedition as yet undertaken or planned at that time. So it's in partnership with Rolex. What they do when they're planning an expedition like this is they look through their grantees. I was awarded that grant, by the way, partly because really important area, this in the Indian Himalaya. Lots of people living downstream of the glaciers depend on the fresh water to some extent to provide the required irrigation for their agricultural systems and drinking water. So I was a National Geographic grantee at the time. I'd received a grant. And what National Geographic do when they're planning one of their expeditions, they look through their grantees, their active grantees, to see who has expertise in the relevant fields to kind of help plan and conduct the science that will be done on the expedition. So obviously my entire PhD was putting up weather stations on glaciers. Then it was Iceland as well as Sweden, so working on the Langjökull ice cap there. And obviously I was putting these weather stations up in the Indian Himalaya. So the lead scientist is a guy called Paul Majewski at the University of Maine in the States. Fantastic, very well accomplished scientist. He spent literally years in Antarctica in tents. And he was overseeing the scientific team. He was putting it together. But I think National Geographic suggested to him that I might be a good fit. And I was invited to a meeting quite early on. This back in the days when we could all travel, but the drop of a hat. So it was pretty much 2 years ago to this time of year. It was end of August, early September that I arrived in Washington, DC. This was just after I started at Loughborough, actually, to talk about the prospect of doing this. At the time, I remember just finding it so surreal. They were planning to put a weather station very near the top of Everest, and turning to me and saying, what kind of things do we need? What should we measure? And I was just so excited that I had the opportunity to feed in at this point. And to cut a long story short, myself and another scientist from North America who was well known to Paul already and worked together with him a lot, a guy called Baker Perry from Appalachian State University in North Carolina, were put together to help lead the installation of the weather stations. And Baker was, just couldn't ask for a better person to work with. So that started in, the real planning kickoff meeting, I think, was in October 2018, and we were due to go and do it to leave in March 2019. So there's not much time for a big expedition like that. So that's how it started. That's how I was lucky enough to be drafted in to help with that.
So how did you prepare yourself for this? Because I don't think a typical scientist or any other person, in fact, if they said to me, right, you've got to climb top of Everest, in a month, or even if a year, I wouldn't even know where to start preparing for that. So did you have to have like a routine or anything to get you ready for this?
Yes, yes to those questions. We did need, we needed to work hard and quickly. I mean, I'm not a professional, well, clearly not a professional mountaineer. I like the mountains, spend a lot of time in the mountains, but I was not a technical mountaineer. I've done some rock climbing, some lead climbing, and some sort of winter, so Arctic winter travel things where you're moving with sleds and building snow holes and that kind of thing. But I'm not, certainly not someone that was there as a, on the merits of being a mountaineer. That wasn't why I was drafted in. But the interest that I had, and the same with the other scientists that were there, the other scientists that were going to work higher on the mountain, we all like our kind of endurance sports, and the other two guys actually do even more in the mountains. So, regularly had gone to over 6,000 meters in South America and the Andes there. I'd been 6,000 meters in the Indian Himalayas before. So whilst it's an enormous stretch, it wasn't as alien as it would be to many people. I knew what was involved in going to, well, I had an idea of what would be involved in going to over 8,000 meters in the Himalayas. And at the point I joined the expedition, actually, I was not meant to be going right to the highest point. I was going to be going to Camp 2, which is 6,400 meters. Still through the icefall, the Cuppa icefall, which is kind of the most scary bit. But we knew approximately what was in store, and it didn't put us off because it's kind of self-selecting this field. So, work in mountain weather and climate and glaciers because I love the mountains and like being in those environments. So, and the same with the other scientists that are there. So we knew what was in store, and that's why we were so excited about being involved in it. It wasn't as though we were approached in our desk jobs by National Geographic to say, would you want to go up here? We're of course, in that area because we want to be doing that kind of stuff. And that's why our research was already aligned. But then, we had to work very hard, very quickly. And National Geographic gave us all the resources and help needed to, do things like from planning workout routines to, we had a pilot expedition in January where we went to Nepal in the winter, did ice climbing and practicing ascending lead ropes. Ascending fixed lines, which is an unusual thing that's done in mountaineering. I say unusual, it's not the way that the mountains in the Alps are typically climbed. They're climbed in what's called alpine style. The Himalayan peaks, you are climbing fixed lines that other mountaineers have gone ahead and put in, and you're using a device that's what I should have used as my artifact, that helps you ascend at the line. So it only moves one way. It's attached to your harness, and you slide it up, and then it holds you. So that's what most of the mountaineering on these big peaks, the commercial expeditions, climb. That's how they're doing it. You're ascending these fixed lines. We did all the training for that in January. And I say I run marathons. I did lots of running to get fit. You need to be fit to undertake an Everest expedition. You need enough technical expertise to make sure you can abseil and go up the ropes and whatnot. And beyond that, ideas of being on glaciers and being in cold environments, that you kind of need to get through something like that, because the way that Pete Athens, who ended up leading the climbing on the expedition, he was a climbing lead. He's summited Everest 7 times. His name's Mr. Everest. He's a fantastically accomplished mountaineer, and he kept us very safe. The way he described Everest is it's a suffer fest. you're there to endure and suffer, and you do need to be fit, but you don't need to be an Olympic athlete to go. It's about endurance in the sense of the word, that you are enduring the environment and all the demands for months on end. Lots of fitness to get ready to go, but also more demanding was getting the science ready to go. Everything from designing the weather stations to preparing the weather forecast to be delivered to us automatically on the mountain via satellite phone, that kind of stuff. It was an incredible time. It was really intense, but incredibly rewarding, and fantastic to work with like Paul Baker and the other people on the team.
It sounds brutal just from what you've said, but you also went at a time when there was a huge issue with overcrowding. What was that like? And did you face any other difficulties while you were ascending?
Yes, it was a very busy year, and that was because of the weather, actually. Or rather, the weather had a very large part to play in that. So the weather would dictate when people could make their summit attempt. So you can only head up high on the mountain when the winds are not too strong. And if the winds are blowing hard for a long time, then no one can make their summit attempt. If you only get a few days and the winds drop, everyone is going to be forced through that bottleneck. And as it happened, there were a lot of permits granted that year, but there have been similar numbers granted in other years. But the weather windows were just so that everyone was funneled into these very short periods. So that was a problem. But it wasn't too much of a surprise either, because you can see the number of people when you're up there moving between the high camps. We knew that it could potentially be a problem. It became, as anyone who's seen the documentary will know, it became really apparent on the night that we tried to go towards the summit to install the highest weather station, and ultimately we had to modify our plans because of the number of people on the mountain. But again, we had a really good, fantastically experienced Sherpa team and Sherpa lead called Panuru, and we were never really in doubt that he'd make the correct call. He knows the mountain, he knows the times, knew the times very well. The times being how long would it take us to get to the summit based on the speed that we were moving, based on the number of people that were ahead, and with that, how long would we have to try and install the weather station given those extrapolations. And we had the big constraint up there of oxygen availability. You can only last as long as the tank that you're carrying on your back that's supplying the air that you breathe. It's like being an underwater diver in many senses.
So obviously the weather is an issue, the overcrowding is an issue. Am I right in thinking as well you got sick while you were climbing?
Yeah, I think it's one of the, I don't know how common it is, but I think it's pretty common. But one of the less talked about challenges of trying to climb Everest is that you're pretty much guaranteed to be trying to climb it whilst you're sick, or at least at some point during the climb you'll be sick. And I don't mean you're nauseous and you're vomiting. The most typical sicknesses are, well, actually stomach upsets can be quite common. But also respiratory infections. So we had a bad case of, or kind of an epidemic of flu in our team. Now our team was unlucky because we were quite big. We had lots of scientists doing different things. Some at base camp and lower, some higher up on the mountain. And unfortunately, as we all know too well now in the world that we're currently in, social distancing is key. And that's harder to do when there are lots of people sharing a relatively small space. So we would all come together to eat our meals in the base camp tent, and I think there might be around 25 people in that tent at once. One person's unlucky enough to get sick, pretty soon everyone's sick. So yeah, I had, I think, 1 or 2 respiratory infections and a stomach issue when I was there, and unfortunately most of our team did. Thankfully, when we actually went for kind of the highest science part of the expeditions and we moved towards the summit, most of us we'd all pretty much recovered from the sicknesses that we had. But to say that you're 100% would be stretching it. So you don't really get away, you don't really lose the kumbu cough that people may have heard of. The very dry air irritates the back of your throat, and you kind of have a semi-permanent sore throat, even if you've cleared any respiratory infections that also may have caused the sore throat earlier. So you never quite feel 100%, even when you're healthy. But some of that reflects these infections, but also a fascinating observation up there is that the altitude really does do some interesting things to your body, including you lose a lot of weight, even if you're healthy. So even if you're not sick, your appetite plunges. And you actually become less fit when you're up there. Studies have shown that your VO2 maximum, if there are any sports people out there that know about your VO2 maximum, typically lower after you come back from an Everest expedition than when you set out, which can seem counterintuitive because you spend almost every day when you're heading uphill sucking for air, breathing deeply, the equivalent of however you feel when you're trying to run a 5K, when you're running at pretty intense pace. It's the same kind of intensity that you've been moving at or you're working at when you're climbing there. So you're breathing hard and you come back actually less fit than when you went out. So there's a bizarre attritional effect of altitude in the body to overcome. Fascinating, yeah, really challenging.
How was it coming back then? Because to me, doing that, getting to the top, seeing what you've seen, coming back must be kind of like, oh, back to everyday life it is then. So how was it coming back? And you also had to deal with a lot of media work. So how was that, trying to get, back used to everyday life and then having to talk to press on top of that?
It's really interesting actually to reflect on that. The coming back bit, it was, I suppose it is a bit of an anticlimax coming back. For me, it's an incredible place, Everest. So I know that, it's kind of lost some of its, romantic ideal, I suppose, because it's been climbed by thousands of people now. It's very familiar to many people. But there's a reason that many people have tried to climb it. There's a reason that it's so famous. It's not just that it's the highest mountain on earth. It is an incredibly awe-inspiring landscape. The Western Cwm that is, overlooked by not just Everest, but Lhotse and Nuptse, and then you've got Pomori Peak on the side. If you like the mountains, it is phenomenal and so awe-inspiring. You hear the ground shake most nights when you're laying in your tent from avalanches that are going, happening far enough away that you're not worried about them. But it's just such a dynamic and imposing landscape. And I've spent a fair bit of time in mountain ranges around the world, and I'd heard from other people in places like the Pyrenees, the Alps, that had been to the Himalayas, and even in the Indian Himalayas, that had actually, said, well, the Himalayas and Nepal, they're not so impressive. Because you're already up high, you don't really see the great grandiose nature of the mountains because they're not that much higher than you. No, it's incredible. They are like nothing I've ever seen anywhere else. They are monsters in every way and really, really impressive. So coming back, of course, you're leaving that landscape behind, and getting back into the day job it's the same as it is for many great adventures like that. It's a bit of a shock to the system, but actually there are so many things to do in terms of, in our case, looking at the data coming back from the weather stations, making sense for everything that had happened. There was plenty to keep busy with. And in terms of the press activity or the media activity, it was something that was, really is a real privilege to be part of, to be talking about these really important things, because we weren't going to Everest for fun. The research that's done there is really important. Hundreds of millions of people living downstream of these catchments. And there are data from Everest, but very limited data in terms of weather and the other kind of glaciological data that other members of the team were collecting. And it's been recognised in these research communities that data are needed from these places. It's just so hard to get, and it's not cheap, and it's risky, that you don't see much ground being made. I mean, some fantastic researchers out there have been making ground slowly for years, getting data from these hard to reach environments. But going to the upper slopes of Everest is a huge undertaking, and it takes someone like National Geographic who's willing to take the risk to come on board and to back something in order for that to change. So it's a tremendous privilege to be part of that, and also to get the opportunity to sort of tell the story afterwards, to say, well, yes, we're doing this, and it may be the highest weather station, the highest ice core in the world, but there's a reason that these places are being visited, and this is the story, the wider story around what's going on in the high mountains, that the climate is changing, and we are seeing more ice melt. And this is unusual in the context of thousands of years, and that this matters for people living downstream. And it also matters, the same story is playing out in the Karakoram, so in Pakistan, in South America, in the Rocky Mountains of North America, in the Alps. So it was really rewarding to get to be part of that process. And National Geographic have an incredible platform. They reach a lot of people. So it was a real privilege to be part of that.